You were never meant to hear this. Not here, not now, not in the light of a world that pretends to keep its hands clean. What I'm about to tell you was buried, not lost, hidden, not forgotten. It has been whispered in families who pretend they never spoke the words, sealed in archives that were never meant to be opened. It begins in Utah in the year 1856 with a family that should never have been remembered at all. The Fairmonts, a name polished like silver, carved into stone, admired in public. But behind that name lurked something else, a secret more disturbing than madness, more deliberate than evil, a secret written into the very blood of a dynasty. Picture the Utah desert, red cliffs towering like walls of a prison, sagebrush twisting against dry wind, a valley where survival itself was the only religion. And there, standing out against that desolation, the Fairmont estate, 3,000 acres of symmetry and wealth that had no business existing in a place meant only for grit and hunger. Its sandstone manor rose like a fortress, its gardens grew with an unnatural perfection, and its imported fruit trees bent with harvests the land itself could not provide. To the struggling families of Cedar Valley, the Fairmonts seemed like pioneers blessed by fortune itself, proof that civilization could bloom in the wasteland. But fortune is a mask, and perfection is the mask corruption wears when it does not want to be seen. Beneath the Fairmont name was a history stitched together like a counterfeit tapestry, records forged, pedigrees invented, accidents too precise to be accidents, neighbors collapsing at the exact moment their land was needed, rivals undone by tragedy that struck like clockwork, and behind every loss in the valley stood the Fairmonts, untouchable, smiling, their hands clean, at least on the surface. What you must understand is this: the Fairmonts were not simply lucky, and they were not simply ruthless. They were something far more dangerous. They were engineered, trained, cultivated across generations like a crop bred for one purpose: domination. Their wealth was not fortune. It was a system. Their survival was not chance. It was design. And once you see the design, once you see how deeply it threads into the marrow of civilization itself, you will never look at history or your own bloodline the same way again. When a traveler named Jacob Hensworth first walked into Cedar Valley in the winter of 1856, he believed he was chasing history. He was a genealogist, a man of records and documents, paid to trace bloodlines across the fractured frontier. He carried with him a leather satchel filled with parish seals, birth registries, and faded maps. What he did not know was that this satchel would make him the most dangerous man in Utah, because knowledge in the wrong valley is more threatening than a gun. Hensworth was welcomed at the Fairmont estate with charm. The patriarch, Augustus Fairmont, was the kind of man who seemed carved from old Europe. Silver hair, polished speech, eyes that measured everything. His wife, Ella, was grace personified, a figure who distributed charity to the poor with hands too soft to ever touch hardship. Their children were handsome, accomplished, and admired. To the people of Cedar Valley, the Fairmonts were nobility reborn on American soil. To Hensworth, at first, they were simply another family seeking validation of their lineage. But it was in the quiet glow of the Fairmont study that doubt began its crawl. By firelight, Augustus laid out his family records with pride, documents stretching back to English parishes, seals pressed in ink, names echoing with the grandeur of old blood. At first glance, they gleamed with legitimacy, but Hensworth's trained eye caught what the townsfolk never could. The seals bore mistakes no real parish clerk would have made. The handwriting, impossibly, was the same across centuries, as though time itself had never touched it. What he held in his hands was not a genealogy, but a performance too perfect. And then there was the presence. Across the fire, Augustus did not speak like a man proud of heritage. He spoke like a predator dissecting prey. His eyes did not merely meet Hensworth's, they penetrated, probed, weighed him like a butcher studies livestock. It was not hostility, it was evaluation, the kind of gaze that strips away illusion and measures only use or weakness. That night, Hensworth should have left, but the human weakness for truth held him captive. He wanted proof, he wanted certainty, and so he stayed, not realizing that by stepping into the Fairmont manor, by sipping their imported brandy, he had already entered their web. He was no longer a man investigating history. He was prey under observation. The next morning, the frost on Hensworth's window had not melted, though the sun was high. His satchel, his lifeline, his archive, his weapon had been disturbed, not stolen, not ransacked, disturbed. The papers were shuffled, seals pressed and unpressed, the order undone, nothing missing, and that was the terror. Whoever had touched his belongings hadn't been searching for evidence. They had been measuring him, calculating how much he had already uncovered, testing the depth of his intrusion into their mask. That realization chilled him more than the desert frost. He was not a guest in Cedar Valley anymore. He was a specimen under observation. Every step he took, every word he spoke, every glance of his eye would be carried back to the head of the Fairmont table, weighed against the family's ledger of control. That evening, he was summoned, not invited, but summoned, to the Fairmont estate for dinner. He obeyed, and what he saw in that hall was not a meal, but a ritual. The silver gleamed too perfectly polished. The imported wine flowed with rehearsed ease. The laughter at the table rose and fell with the rhythm of a play. It was all performance, and beneath it ran something darker, precision. Children who spoke not with innocence, but with guarded poise. Conversations that unfolded like chess moves. Neighbors' tragedies mentioned not with grief, but with analysis, as though misfortunes were pieces removed from a board. The twins unsettled him most, Augustus Jr. and Victoria, 17 years old. They carried themselves not like children, but like diplomats rehearsed for power. When a widow's loss was mentioned, Victoria spoke, her voice smooth but sharp. How unfortunate he proved inadequate to the demands of life. No malice, no pity, only judgment, as though the death of a man was a failed experiment, a statistic to be filed away. Augustus Jr. followed, Cole, dare still. Strength bends, weakness breaks, the valley survives when the weak are removed. Words spoken not in cruelty, but in doctrine, doctrine drilled into blood. And in that moment, Hensworth began to understand. This wasn't just about forged documents or a counterfeit pedigree. It wasn't even about greed. It was about something cultivated, inherited, embedded. These children were not taught kindness. They were taught evaluation. They were trained not to feel, but to measure. And in their voices, Hensworth heard something terrifying. Not the corruption of a family, but the refinement of a dynasty engineered for predation. The valley believed the Fairmonts were blessed, but what Hensworth saw was the truth. The valley itself had been turned into their experiment. By the third night, the cracks in the Fairmont mask revealed themselves like fissures in stone. Augustus, the patriarch, sat in his high-backed chair by the fire, glass of brandy in hand, speaking as if to no one in particular. His children gathered before him in silence, like disciples awaiting doctrine, and what he spoke was not philosophy, it was instruction. Weakness is contagion, he said, swirling the amber liquid. Recognize it instantly. Remove it from your sphere. If a man cannot serve you, then he must serve as an example. His words dripped with the calm certainty of a priest giving sacrament. But this was no sermon. It was a blueprint. Theodore, his eldest, stepped forward with a leather-bound ledger. Inside were names of neighbors, merchants, even the town bishop. Beside each name, notes, debts, scandals, family illnesses. Every entry catalogued not as gossip, but as leverage, points of pressure. Augustus gestured for his children to recite from the book. Victoria's young voice, chillingly composed, read aloud. Mrs. Jensen, 3 sons, 2 dead from fever, husband unstable, financial strain, easily persuaded by charity, pliable with sympathy, not a threat. She turned the page without flinching, her tone detached, clinical, as though she were labeling livestock. Then Augustus Jr. spoke. Mr. Walsh refuses to sell land, strong-willed, but daughter is ill, dependent on medicine from Salt Lake. Intercept supply. Wait 2 weeks. He will fold. It was not speculation. It was calculation. It was education. This was the true inheritance of the Fairmont children. Not wealth, not titles, but the systematic transfer of cruelty across generations. They weren't raised as children. They were trained as strategists, sharpened like blades, taught to see people not as human beings, but as weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Hensworth sat frozen, realizing that what he witnessed wasn't improvisation, it was tradition, a ritual of indoctrination. Every family has stories passed down by firelight. The Fairmonts passed down predation. This was their legacy. Control disguised as refinement, cruelty dressed as civilization. That night, as Hensworth left the estate, the desert wind felt different, colder. The shadows of the cliffs loomed like prison walls. He knew then that the Fairmont family's secret was not simply forged papers or fraudulent nobility. Their secret was far older, far darker, a dynasty of predators bred through blood and perfected through doctrine. And he, by listening, had already been pulled too far inside to ever walk away unchanged. In the county seat, 2 days' ride from Cedar Valley, the ledgers told a story that the Fairmont estate would never admit aloud. Hensworth, under the cover of night, pored over brittle papers by the light of a single oil lamp, and what he discovered bled through history like a wound. The Fairmonts had not always been Fairmonts. Before Utah, they had been Fleers. Before that, Phones. Before that, still other names. Each identity was shed like a serpent's skin when suspicion grew too heavy, when bodies lay too thick in their wake. Each time they moved, the pattern repeated. Sudden fortune, vanished rivals, unexplained deaths, and a new name polished into respectability. It wasn't migration. It was molting. Hensworth traced them back through Missouri, through Pennsylvania, through towns where prosperity bloomed briefly, then curdled. A sheriff recalled their eyes that looked at men the way a butcher looks at livestock. Evaluating, weighing, measuring. He remembered children who did not play, who did not laugh, but watched, always watched, as though rehearsing how to control. One boy, barely 12, had whispered to him, "Sheriff, you should be careful. People who oppose us never stay long." The words of a child should be innocent. These words were prophecy. The sheriff's voice shook as he spoke of a teacher named Margaret Daly, who dared to question the family aloud. She said their prosperity was too precise, their fortunes too clean, their tragedies always someone else's. Weeks later, her schoolhouse burned with her inside, along with 3 orphans under her care. The town wept. The Fairmonts, or Fleers as they were then, stepped forward with generosity, offering to build a new school at their own expense. But this time, they chose the teachers. They shaped the curriculum, and from that day forward, every child grew up beneath their hand. Hensworth understood then that this family's secret wasn't simply blood. It was control. They had mastered not just the art of survival, but the art of assimilation. When enemies arose, they were erased. When rivals appeared, they were absorbed. And when suspicion mounted, the family shed its name and emerged reborn, cloaked again in respectability. But here lies the most unsettling truth. The Fairmonts were not alone. They were simply successful. How many other families, praised in your history books, carved into marble, had built their fortunes not on virtue, but on this same quiet system of selective breeding and calculated misfortune? How much of civilization itself was written not by saints, but by predators in silk gloves? Sheriff Thomas Brennan had carried his silence like a coffin for 30 years. When Hensworth finally found him in a smoky tavern on the edge of Philadelphia, his hair was white, his hands trembled, but his eyes still burned with the memory of what he had seen. When the genealogist laid the name Fairmont across the table, Brennan froze. Slowly he lowered his glass and whispered, "I prayed I'd never hear that name again." What spilled out then was not testimony, it was confession. Brennan spoke of the family when they were still called Fones back in the 1820s and 30s. They had arrived in his town with wealth, polish, and promises of prosperity. They bought land, they opened businesses, they married into influence, and then, as always, the accidents began. A strong swimmer drowned in shallow water. A banker, who had refused their request, was found hanging in his barn. A suicide with no debt, no despair, nothing but the convenience of his death. A competitor's fever claimed him alone, touching no one else in the household. Again and again, the family profited where others perished, each tragedy perfectly aligned with opportunity. But what haunted Brennan most were the children. They did not run in fields or play in dust like the others. They watched, always watching. Their eyes moved across people as though weighing grain, measuring strengths, cataloging weaknesses. And when they spoke, their words came out rehearsed, not the speech of children, but of apprentices. One boy, no more than 12, looked Brennan in the eye and said, "You should be careful, Sheriff. People who oppose us never stay long." There was no malice in the boy's tone, no anger, only certainty. A child should not carry certainty like that. Then Brennan leaned closer, his voice breaking into a whisper. "They don't just eliminate threats. They convert them. I saw it. A man who hated them one year became their ally the next. Walking different, speaking different. It was like they had broken him and rebuilt him. I don't know how. Blackmail, poison, something worse. But once the family marked you, you never came back the same." Hensworth's hand clenched around his glass, because in Cedar Valley he had seen it too. Neighbors once proud, once independent, now subdued, deferential, not merely afraid, changed. Their wills had been bent until they were pliant. And in that moment, Hensworth realized the Fairmonts weren't just predators of blood. They were engineers of submission. The deeper Hensworth listened, the clearer it became. The Fairmonts did not rule with fear alone. Fear is clumsy. Fear sparks rebellion. What they practiced was subtler, cleaner, a science of control. First came at dependency. They chose one family in every town, the poorest, the most desperate, and lifted them up with sudden charity. Food, medicine, schooling for the children. It was never kindness, it was investment. Soon that family could not imagine life without the Fairmonts. Their loyalty was not bought, it was grown, and loyalty, once seeded, spread like infection. Next was division. When neighbors grew too united, too close, the Fairmonts whispered. A rumor here, a secret there, a quiet suggestion that one family envied another, that a wife had strayed, that a son had stolen. Distrust festered, communities fractured, while others argued the Fairmonts expanded. Then came the tests. Always small at first. Sell us your land for less than it's worth. Agree to a marriage between your daughter and our son. Support us in council, though your conscience says no. These weren't requests, they were measurements. The Fairmonts didn't care about the land, the marriage, the vote. They cared about whether the person bent. And once someone bent once, they would bend again. But the cruelest tactic was reconstruction. For those too strong, too stubborn, too resistant, the family broke them slowly. Isolation, financial ruin, subtle humiliation in public until the person was hollowed out, their pride in tatters, and then the hand extended, alone, a position, a lifeline. The victim would grasp it, desperate, and when they did, they belonged to the Fairmonts forever, not enslaved by chains, but by gratitude poisoned with shame. Hensworth began to see the invisible machinery. Every family in Cedar Valley fit into a role: the indebted, the divided, the tested, or the reconstructed. The town was not free. It was a living laboratory, an experiment in control perfected over generations. And in his notes, he wrote one chilling line: "The Fairmont method is not extraordinary. It is repeatable, which means it is portable." What terrified him most was not that the Fairmonts had mastered this art, but that others could learn it. That what began in one valley could seep outward, family to family, town to town, until entire nations bent under dynasties trained not in compassion, but in the quiet arithmetic of power. Hensworth had always believed himself an observer, detached, analytical, immune to the games of those he studied. But the Fairmonts did not permit observers. To them, every man was either asset, obstacle, or prey, and so, without warning, they began to test him. It started small. A servant misplaced his satchel, forcing him to reveal whether he trusted the household to return it. He did. A mark recorded. Next, Augustus Jr. asked him to stay longer in Cedar Valley than planned, framing it as curiosity about genealogy. Would Hensworth bend his schedule to the family's desires? He agreed. Another mark. Then Victoria invited him to dinner again, though she was only 17. But at the table she asked questions not of his work, but of his life. Whom he trusted, who awaited his return, who might come looking if he vanished. Her smile never wavered. She was not gathering conversation. She was measuring isolation. The turning point came one evening when Augustus, the patriarch, placed a hand heavy with rings on Hensworth's shoulder. "You've a keen eye for legacy, sir. We could use a man like you to catalog, to preserve, to ensure our name never fades." His tone was silk, but the weight of the words was iron. It was not an offer. It was a test of allegiance. That night, Hensworth realized the structure of their method. They had shifted him, step by step, from observer to participant. He was now in their ledger, his strengths and weaknesses noted, his pliability charted. The question was no longer whether he would bend, but how quickly. And he could feel it, the slow erosion of his independence. Meals provided by them, shelter on their land, protection under their watch. The very comforts they extended became chains, tightening link by link. He told himself he was infiltrating their system, documenting it. But in the ledger of the Fairmonts, he had been reclassified. No longer genealogist, no longer guest. Now, prospect. And in his private journal, his handwriting grew jagged with panic. "I am no longer studying the Fairmonts. I am becoming one of their subjects." It was not one event, but a sequence, subtle at first, then undeniable, that convinced Hensworth his escape was already sealed. One morning, when he entered the study, his journal was no longer where he had left it. The leather cover bore faint smudges, not his own. No one mentioned it, yet Victoria's gaze lingered on him longer that evening, as though she now carried secrets of his that he had not chosen to share. Another time he visited the town inn to inquire about a carriage eastward. The innkeeper smiled politely but told him all the horses were spoken for. The next day, he saw those same horses grazing in a Fairmont pasture. And then came the letter. A simple envelope slipped beneath his door, sealed with red wax. Inside, a single sentence in handwriting that was not his. "We know what you are writing." He burned the letter in the hearth, but the smoke felt like a signal sent up into the night sky. The family never spoke of it, never accused, never confronted. They did not need to. Their silence was more suffocating than words. What terrified him most was how swiftly his world had closed in. Only weeks before, he had moved freely between libraries, records, courthouses. Now his every step was anticipated. If he lingered at the church too long, a Fairmont carriage would arrive to escort him home. If he strayed near the edge of town, a concerned townsman would ask if he was lost. His freedom had been absorbed into their system, quietly, invisibly. He realized then, the Fairmonts did not need to trap him. They had only to guide him, step by step, until the idea of leaving felt unthinkable. In his journal, his script grew frantic. Escape is no longer a matter of distance, it is a matter of will, and I do not know if my will is still my own. That night, as the desert wind howled against the shutters, Hensworth dreamt of himself sitting at Og Eustace's great chair by the fire, ledger in hand, teaching children not his own, teaching their doctrine in their voice. He woke drenched in sweat, but with a horrifying certainty that the dream was not a warning. It was a rehearsal. The first cracks did not appear in Hensworth's body, but in his mind. He began hearing his own thoughts in another voice. At first subtle, the cadence of Augustus in his head when he weighed decisions. Then sharper, Victoria's laughter echoing in his memory when he hesitated over a lie. The more time he spent in Cedar Valley, the less he could separate his observations from their influence. His notebook became a battlefield, half written in his hand, half sounding like theirs. By day, he assured himself he was still resisting, still recording evidence. By night, he questioned whether his resistance itself was only another role they had assigned him, the illusion of independence that made the moment of surrender more complete. The townsfolk deepened his paranoia. Once friendly farmers no longer spoke to him as a guest. They greeted him as though he already belonged, their deference spreading like contagion. "Mr. Hensworth, sir. Your place at the council table is waiting. You are with them, aren't you?" He would shake his head, deny it, but the denials grew weaker each time, because what if they were right? What if, without his consent, the shift had already occurred? Sleep brought no refuge. His dreams turned ritualistic. Endless dinners at the Fairmont table, endless toasts raised in his honor, endless voices praising his loyalty. In one dream, Augustus pressed a hand on his chest and whispered, "You were never studying us. We were studying you." He woke gasping, fingernails dug into his palms, blood drawn from his own flesh, as though trying to claw his way back into himself. He scrawled in the margins of his journal, the words angled, frantic, barely legible. How do you know when you have been remade? Perhaps the moment you ask the question is already too late. And then, beneath it, a line he had no memory of writing. "I am ready." Hensworth no longer trusted mirrors. When he caught his reflection in the glass of the study cabinet, the man who stared back seemed older, sharper, his posture too erect, his gaze too certain. It was not how he felt inside, frayed, uncertain, unraveling. The reflection belonged to someone else, someone finished, someone aligned. The journal betrayed him next. Whole passages appeared in his hand that he did not recall composing. Crisp, measured paragraphs, cataloging not the Fairmont's corruption, but their strengths, their discipline, their foresight, their inevitability. Each word written with the clinical precision of a scholar, but in praise, not warning. He tore the pages out, burned them, only to find new ones waiting by morning. He tested himself with questions. What is my name? What year is it? Why did I come here? But the answers came back layered. Beneath his own voice, another whispered the same answers, but with subtle corrections. His name, yes, but followed by a steward of legacy. The year, yes, but appended with a year of ascendancy. And the reason he had come? His voice stuttered there, collapsing into silence, while the other voice spoke with perfect clarity. To be chosen. One evening, he found himself at the great oak table again, quill in hand, Augustus watching. Without command, without instruction, Hensworth wrote as though guided, family names, bloodlines, dates, but not his own research. It was something else, a codex, a genealogy not of the past, but of the future, charting alliances, marriages yet to occur, children yet unborn. His handwriting filled the page, but the vision was not his. When the candle guttered, Augustus leaned forward and touched the parchment. You see it now, don't you? This is not study. This is revelation. And in that moment, Hensworth realized the fracture was complete. He was no longer documenting the Fairmonts. He was extending them. His scholarship, his obsession, his very intellect had been harvested, bent, and repurposed. He whispered into the hollow air of his chamber later that night, I am not a prisoner. I am an instrument. But even that, he could not be sure, was his thought. The man who had entered Cedar Valley as Jonathan Hensworth, genealogist, ceased to exist in increments too fine to measure. He no longer kept his journal, he kept their ledger. The leather-bound book that once held frantic confessions now contained only ordered lines of names, debts, oaths, betrayals, not observations, calculations, not warnings, instructions. He no longer asked when he might leave. The notion of leaving felt absurd, almost comical. Where would he go? His work was here, his duty was here, his future was here. The world outside Cedar Valley dimmed in his mind, like a half-remembered childhood story. His reflection changed again. When he passed the tall mirror in the dining hall, he no longer recoiled. The man looking back carried the Fairmont posture, the Fairmont certainty. He recognized the shape of his face, yes, but not the man, and that recognition no longer frightened him. It comforted him. The dreams ceased to torment. Instead, they instructed. In sleep, he saw lineages unfolding, alliances solidifying, dynasties branching like veins through the nation. He awoke with clarity, ready to record what the dream had shown. His hand did not tremble anymore. The writing came fast, fluent, inevitable. When Augustus placed a hand upon his shoulder once more, the gesture was not heavy. It was coronation. You understand now, the patriarch murmured. Blood builds walls, but knowledge builds empires. You were not chosen by chance, Jonathan. You were always meant to serve. And Jonathan Hensworth, or the man who had once borne that name, lowered his head in silent assent. The last fragment of resistance dissolved like ash. From that day forward, the family did not speak of him as guest, nor as scholar. They spoke of him only as custodian. The keeper of their histories, the architect of their futures, a Fairmont, in all but blood and eye. In the hush of his mind, a thought arose, not in rebellion, not in fear, but in reverence. I was never consumed. I was fulfilled. The custodian no longer signed his work. He did not need to. The ledger itself bore his presence, as though the ink carried something more permanent than handwriting. Generations passed, and still the entries continued. No gaps, no faltering hand, no sign that the writer had ever aged. Some whispered the ledger was not written in time, but through it, the custodian's quill moving across past, present, and future as though they were a single flat surface. When descendants opened the book to confirm their roles, they often found their names already waiting, paired with fates they had not yet lived. One heir, a young man named Edwin, once tried to resist. He tore his name from the page, burned the fragment, and fled Cedar Valley. But the fire would not consume the parchment, only his reflection in every mirror thereafter, which grew dim, shadowed, incomplete. When word reached the family that Edwin had drowned in a city fountain, the ledger revealed the torn fragment had already restored itself, his death written neatly long before it occurred. The custodian never spoke. He did not need to. His silence was authority. When a marriage was arranged, when an oath was broken, when blood was shed, all of it bore the weight of inevitability. His presence in the dining hall, always at the end of the table, was enough to remind the Fairmonts that choice was only illusion. And yet, on rare nights when storm clouds blanketed the valley and thunder shook the hills, a strange sound echoed from his chamber, the sound of weeping, low, ragged, human, as if, somewhere beneath the centuries of ink and obedience, a faint ember of Jonathan Hensworth still remained. Not custodian, not prophet, but a man who once came here to study and instead was devoured. No one dared enter when the weeping came. By morning, it was always gone. The ledger, however, grew longer still. The world beyond Cedar Valley had begun to take notice. Historians, economists, even intelligence agencies whispered of a peculiar pattern. Certain families, disparate in name and geography, rose and endured with uncanny symmetry. Their fortunes never collapsed. Their heirs never disappeared into obscurity. Marriages occurred with clockwork precision, often binding rivals into allies. Entire industries seemed to pivot around their bloodlines, as if guided by an unseen hand. A British genealogist, Dr. Margaret Havers, presented a paper suggesting an invisible dynasty spanning centuries, hiding beneath shifting surnames. Her evidence was meticulous, too meticulous. Within a year, her university discredited her work as fabricated. Colleagues swore she had vanished, yet her office remained undisturbed, desk still warm, tea still steeping. In her empty drawer, police found only one item, a half-burned page of unfamiliar parchment, the ink impossibly fresh. Journalists probed, senators whispered, corporations circled, but every investigation ended the same way: silence. Either the researcher disavowed their own findings, or they simply disappeared, their absence explained away with convenient finality. A stroke, a sudden trip abroad, a family emergency. And still, the Fairmont estate in Cedar Valley remained unassuming, almost provincial. The townspeople spoke of it with casual reverence, unaware that beyond its doors, the custodian's hand continued its unbroken work. Those who managed to glimpse him, rare guests, rare confidants, always described the same figure: ageless, pale, eyes sunk deep but sharp as glass, quill never resting, a man, and not a man. Some swore that if you looked long enough into his face, you could see another face layered beneath it, the scholar's, Jonathan Hensworth, forever writing, forever chained to the dynasty he had once hoped to expose. And so the Fairmonts remained untouchable, not because of wealth alone, not because of secrecy alone, but because they held time itself as their inheritance, and the custodian as its keeper. The outsider came in the form of a journalist named Daniel Mercer. He was not searching for the Fairmonts at first. His investigation began with missing persons, scholars, researchers, archivists who had vanished across decades, always while working on obscure genealogical studies. Patterns emerged. At the center of every disappearance stood the same nexus: Cedar Valley. Daniel was methodical. He traced archives, digital and physical, finding fragments of Dr. Haver's suppressed paper, old clippings mentioning the custodian, census anomalies. Again and again, the same conclusion whispered back. The valley was not simply home to a family, but to something larger, something enduring. When he arrived in Cedar Valley, he found a town resistant to questions. Locals smiled too easily, spoke vaguely, deflected. He was offered hospitality but also a strange sense of inevitability, as though his arrival had been expected. That night, a boy slipped Daniel a folded scrap of paper in the tavern. On it was a single line, written in a steady hand: "Your name is already in the ledger." The next day, Daniel drove to the Fairmont estate. He expected locked gates, suspicion. Instead, the iron gates swung wide at his approach. Servants greeted him by name. The patriarch welcomed him as though he were family. And in the library, candlelit and vast, he saw it at last: the black ledger, thick as a tombstone, humming faintly with something like breath. Pages fluttered though there was no breeze, and there, in crisp ink, he found it. Daniel Mercer. Arrival, September 12th, 2025. Purpose, witness. Fate, to be determined. When he looked up, the custodian was watching him from across the table, eyes hollow, quill poised. Daniel swore. In that moment, he saw recognition, as if a voice long buried inside that ageless figure whispered his name with pleading familiarity. The inkwell bubbled, the quill moved, and a new line began to write itself. Daniel's first instinct was defiance. He slammed the ledger shut, the heavy covers echoing like a gunshot in the library's silence. "I don't believe this," he said aloud, though his voice cracked. "You don't decide my life. I do." The custodian did not answer. He simply tilted his head, as though studying a child throwing a tantrum. The quill remained upright, dripping with ink that never seemed to dry. Daniel fled the estate that night. He packed his notes, his laptop, every scrap of evidence, and sped out of Cedar Valley under a moonless sky. He told himself he would publish everything, expose them, drag their secrets into the light. But at every step, the world seemed to bend against him. His files corrupted, his backups vanished. Sources retracted statements or swore they'd never spoken to him. His editor at the paper dismissed his story as incoherent, then asked him why he'd submitted an empty draft. Daniel checked the file again. The words he had written were gone, replaced by a single line: Daniel Mercer, departure, September 13th, 2025. Purpose, resistance. Fate, completion. His heart froze. He hadn't written those words. Panic set in. He tried to call his sister. The phone rang once, then cut to static. On his desk, his notebook flipped open on its own. Ink bled across the page, forming shapes, then letters, then sentences. His handwriting, though he had not moved the pen. Every choice you make is ink already dried. Daniel screamed, ripped the notebook apart, set it ablaze in his sink. For a moment the pages curled and blackened. He thought he had won. But in the smoke, words shimmered against the wall, faint and glowing. The same words, continuing the same line. His fate was not changing. It was only being transcribed elsewhere. And somewhere in Cedar Valley, the custodian's hand never paused. Daniel returned to Cedar Valley. He told himself it was a choice, but he already knew better. Each mile closer to the estate felt like retracing a path his body had walked before, as though memory itself had been written into the road. The gates opened again without touch. The servants did not question him. No one ever did. He walked through corridors that felt both familiar and foreign, as if he had lived here once, long ago. At the far end of the library, the custodian waited. The ledger was open to the page bearing Daniel's name. More lines had appeared since his last visit. Fear, flight, return, confrontation. Daniel's hands trembled. "Why me?" he demanded, voice hoarse. "Why write me at all? What do you want from me?" For the first time, the custodian moved more than his hand. His gaze lifted, heavy and ancient, and his lips parted. What emerged was not a word, but a sound, brittle, unused for centuries, a whisper dragged from a throat that had forgotten speech. Relief. Daniel staggered. The voice was not inhuman. It was weary, broken. He saw, in the hollow sockets of those eyes, the faintest flicker of a man still trapped beneath centuries of ink. Jonathan Hensworth, begging without begging. The quill clattered to the desk. The ledger's pages shivered, then turned themselves faster and faster until the sound filled the library like a storm. Names blurred past. Generations, centuries, lives devoured. And then Daniel saw his own face staring back at him from the page, but older, colder, quill in hand. The custodian stood for the first time in memory and stepped aside. The chair at the ledger was empty, waiting. Daniel refused the chair. He backed away, shaking his head, heart hammering. "No, I'm not you. I won't be you." His words sounded small in the cavernous library, swallowed by the rustle of the ledger's turning pages. The custodian did not argue. He only watched. His withered hands rested at his sides, empty now, as though his role had already passed on. Daniel turned and ran. The doors of the library groaned, but did not budge. The windows, though clear as glass, were hard as stone beneath his fists. Every corridor he fled through curved impossibly back into the same chamber, the same desk, the same waiting chair. The ledger always before him, the custodian always beside it. Desperation became fury. Daniel seized the ledger, intent on tearing it apart, burning it, destroying it. But the moment his hands touched the black leather, the book no longer felt foreign. It felt familiar, warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly like a second heartbeat. Ink bled from his fingertips, soaking into the pages, forming letters not written by his conscious mind. His name scrawled again and again, branching into futures he could not recognize, possibilities spreading like veins. The custodian stepped forward at last, not to stop him, but to place a hand upon his shoulder. The touch was light, almost human, and then the figure's body collapsed into dust, cloak, bones, all unraveling into silence. Daniel screamed as the ledger pulled harder, the chair dragging beneath him. His body resisted, but his hand already clutched the quill. The ink shimmered with inevitability, and then he understood. The fight was not defiance. The fight was the last step. The new line formed on its own, in his hand, but not his will. Daniel Mercer, acceptance, custodian, continuity. The chair closed around him. The ink began again. The Fairmont estate fell silent for 3 days. No servants were seen entering or leaving. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones, recalling the strange storms that lingered above the valley, lightning that forked but never touched the ground. On the 4th day, the gates opened again. Life resumed as if nothing had happened. Deliveries came, guests arrived, the lamps in the windows glowed through the night. But something had changed. Visitors who entered the library now spoke of a new presence at the ledger. The same desk, the same quill, yet the figure seated there was different, younger, sharper, eyes not sunken, but bright with restless vigilance. A man who once carried defiance in his voice, but now carried silence in his veins. The custodian had changed, but the role had not. Daniel Mercer's name no longer appeared in the ledger as a mortal entry. His line had been struck through, replaced with a single word, written larger than the rest. Custodian. From then on, the book continued without pause. Marriages arranged, deaths scheduled, disappearances foretold, and when researchers and journalists whispered about Daniel Mercer, the missing reporter, their voices dwindled into the same vanishing silence that had consumed others before him. No trace of his work survived. No evidence remained. Only the ledger grew heavier, its pages swelling with new inevitabilities. And in the candlelit library of Cedar Valley, the new custodian wrote steadily, endlessly, while somewhere deep inside, the last remnants of Daniel's humanity screamed against the ink, unheard, unheeded, already forgotten. The Fairmonts endured, the ledger endured, the custodian endured.